Hey everyone, how's everything going? How have the book gods been treating you? Have you been blessed with amazing good reads? Not the website, but actually good reads? Or have you been cursed with boring things to read and just not engaging? Let me know. I hope it's been good most of all. As you know, my name is Andre. I'm here today to not give you a book review, interesting, but give you book recommendations. Today I'll be recommending 4 different trilogies that were pivotal when I was a teenager starting to read fantasy. And these gave me huge amount of love for fantasy and made me see how big the fantasy world could be. I was a late bloomer in terms of reading. I only started reading fantasy when I was 14 years old. And I started by reading things like Narnia Chronicles, Aragon, those big names that all teenagers, or at least young teenagers, children read. And eventually I started reading bigger things and better things. And that's the ones I want to talk to you about. Because I mean, even though Narnia Chronicles and Aragon are good books, I still love them. I don't feel like they can really be compared with some other great works of fantasy. And especially because I read them when I was so young, then I have this lens of nostalgia that I I have a special appreciation for them. I know they have their downfalls, but they're still quite good in my heart. So don't want to talk about those. I want to talk about other ones that I think, again, this is still subjective. It's not an objective opinion because those don't exist, but I still think these are quite important to let other people know they exist and motivate them to read them. But anyways, let's move on to those recommendations. Okay, if I were to recommend all the trilogies and all the series of books that I loved when I started reading, then this would be many hour long video. And I know you don't have time for that. I don't have time for that. So I'll just restrict this to 4 trilogies. And those 4 trilogies, the only rule I applied was that they had to be from a different decade, not when I was reading them, but when they were published, just to give you a different view of what was happening in fantasy across these 40 years almost or more. There will be more recommendation videos in the future. Today we're gonna stick with this one, see how it goes. Let me know what you think, because that's the most important thing. Again, these books, they weren't exactly the most famous at the time, nor I think they were the most famous when they got published. These are just books that were quite important in my reading life that I found were pivotal to make my perspective of fantasy change to broaden their horizons, let's say. And then again, this doesn't mean that these books are my favorites. Some of them are indeed favorites, but others are just books that I thought were quite pivotal into changing opinions. And because of that, you might think that it is a book that you might want to read, or maybe not. I'll leave that up to you. But then again, my job is just to give the recommendations. You decide if you want to take them or not. And the last thing I want to say is that I read all these books when I was in Portugal, not US, not UK. So you might think there might be some books that were better chosen than others, but that's just because the selection in Portugal of fantasy books is, let's say, a bit selective. So there isn't a lot of books, fantasy, sci-fi whatsoever. So this was what was available for me. And also because of that, I do not have the books with me at the moment, but I will keep showing the covers around me somewhere or when I'm telling you the synopsis of it. Again, synopsis, if you don't want to be spoiled about it, I will always keep a timestamp about it so that you can skip and not hear the synopsis, but still hear what I have to say about them. But okay, let's get this party started. Turn your time machines and let's go first to the 70s. Let's listen to some ABBA. Okay, the first trilogy is from the 70s, but we're actually starting the story in the 2000s. Imagine me, a teenager, avid reader. I just want to read everything fantasy that comes to my hands, fantasy or sci-fi. And at that time, it was mostly fantasy. I would say probably 99% fantasy. And out of those 99, I would say 98% of those books would have dragons. I was a dragon fanatic, as a lot of fantasy readers are. And then one day, when I was just browsing on a bookstore trying to find my next read, I see this book with a dragon on the cover and a dragon on the title. And I remember perfectly well thinking, well, this is a win. We got a great book ready for us. And that's when I first grabbed Dragonflight by Anne McCaffrey. And my amazement just grew as I realized that the book I was grabbing was just the first of a trilogy. 3 books about dragons, and they all seemed amazing. So of course, my book nerd fantasies were fulfilled, and that was when I met The Dragon Riders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey. This trilogy was published between 1968 and 1978, and that's why I'm including it in the 70s. Even though it was initially published in the 60s, I feel like it probably had the biggest impact in the 70s, where the 2 other books were published. The names of the books are Dragonflight, Dragon Quest, and The White Dragon. The impact these books had on me was immense. It was not only the first time that I was seeing a book where it had fantasy mostly, but then actually some sprinkles of science fantasy, some sprinkles of science fiction into it. And the world building was like anything else I had seen. It was just amazing seeing these dragons as companions so close to their riders, and how the world was designed for them to be almost these knights, but at the same time servants, but almost masters as well. And I admit, at that time, most of my reading had been about male protagonists. So when I grabbed this book and the main character was a female protagonist, it surprised me. And the fact was, I loved reading this new perspective, and it was just showing me how reading from other perspectives created so many more avenues of fantasy and just imagining new things. It was really good. Not to mention the relationship with the dragons. I mean, I had read Aragon, so I knew about the animal companion type of trope, but I think Anne McCaffrey did it in such a raw, animalistic way, but at the same time very intimate. It was very interesting how she was able to craft this type of relationship. The plot is simple enough. I'll read you the synopsis. Again, if you don't want to hear anything about it, just skip to this timestamp. On the beautiful planet Pern, colonized for centuries, landholders and craftsmen have traditionally tied food and supplies to the dragon wares to which they are bound. In times past, the mighty telepathic dragons and their riders were the only protection from the dreaded, life-threatening threat. But it has been over 400 years since the last threatfall, and some people have come to doubt that the menace will ever strike again. But Flaw, rider of Pern's greatest bronze dragon, has no such illusions. The red star is near. Thread will fall soon. See what I mean? Sprinkle some science fiction into it, some animal companion tropes, and a big thread. Get it? But no, seriously, this trilogy opened my eyes to how different protagonists can really bring new adventures into fantasy, and that male protagonists, always reading about them, ends up being boring, and you should actually read more perspectives other than that. And I know that nowadays in fantasy that is the norm. We don't usually have just male protagonists, and there's usually male and non-binary characters around. But yeah, I feel like if you've been stuck on reading similar, always the same, similar perspective, read this trilogy. It's really, really good, and I think it stood the test of time. And then again, it's a great science fiction and fantasy merge. I think they were able to synergize together to create something even better than just the sum of each part. I feel like these books that are by now they're 50 years old, I feel like they're still really great hallmarks of fantasy. And that was it for the 70s. Now let's travel to the 80s and sing along to Madonna and Tina Turner. The trilogy chosen for this decade has a similar story behind it. I was still around the same age. I was still obsessed with dragons, especially because I had read the Dragon Riders of Pern by then. So I just thought, oh my god, dragons are even more amazing than I thought. I want to keep reading things about dragons. So when I was again at a bookstore and I saw another book that had dragon on the title, I was like, well, this is my next big read. And so I grabbed it. And it ended up being a funny mistake. A funny mistake that actually turned into a good lesson. Because the book that I had grabbed was the first book of the Dragonlance Chronicles. The Dragonlance Chronicles at that time in Portugal were a trilogy. and they're authored by Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss. They were published in 1984 and 1985, and the name of the three books are Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Dragons of Winter Night, and Dragons of Spring Dawn. Hard titles to memorize. They're a bit tricky, but I think I got it. Again, the synopsis of the first book is as follows. If you want to skip, this time stamp. Once merely creatures of legend, the dragons have returned to Kryn, but with their arrival comes the departure of the old gods and all healing magic. As war threatens to engulf the land, lifelong friends reunite for an adventure that will change their lives and shape their world forever. When Tanis, Storm, Caramon, Wrestling, Flint, and Tasselhoff see a woman who uses a blue crystal staff to heal a villager, they wonder if it's a sign the gods have not abandoned them all. Fueled by this glimmer of hope, the companions band together to uncover the truth behind the gods' absence, though they aren't the only ones with an interest in the staff. The Seekers, a new religious order, wants the artifact for their own ends, believing it will help them replace the gods and overtake the continent of Ansalon. Now, the companions must assume the unlikely roles of heroes if they hope to prevent the staff from falling into the hands of darkness. Lifelong friends, they went their separate ways. Now they are together again, though each holds a secret from the others in his heart. They speak of a world shadowed with rumors of war. They speak of tales of strange monsters, creatures of myth, creatures of legend. They do not speak of their secrets. Not then. Not until a chance encounter with a beautiful, sorrowful woman who bears a magical crystal staff draws the companions deeper into the shadows, forever changing their lives and shaping the fate of the world. No one expected them to be heroes, least of all, them. Oh boy. As you can see, I did not get what I expected. This was not a book about dragons, and it was not even close to similar to the Dragon Riders of Pern. In the Dragonlance Chronicles, dragons aren't the nice creatures that they were in Anne McCaffrey's books. And we were not following the usual Chosen One trope. This was quite different. And the funny thing is, when I was reading it, I didn't know that this trope was even older than the Chosen One or all these more recent tropes. Because this was actually one of the first times I encountered the fellowship trope. And this book, this trilogy, eventually led me to The Lord of the Rings, which I hadn't read at that time. I knew about it because I had seen the movies, but I hadn't really not much interest in reading the books until I read these. But let's just say that in the same way that Anne McCaffrey showed me how far fantasy could reach, Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman show me how far back fantasy goes and how the origins of fantasy almost. I know that there are many other books before then, but this showed me more or less the primal state of fantasy with Dungeons and Dragons and things like that, where the Dragonlance Chronicles are very similar. This trilogy has the adventure, the character classes, all these very classical tropes of fantasy, and it has a lot of action. It doesn't have big themes or it doesn't deal really with, I mean, it has some themes, of course, but not as philosophical, let's say, as some other books can have. But don't let that deter you. It's still an amazing read and it's still full of engagement and action, like I said. So I felt like I was reading it. It might not have been my favorite, but I was still entertained as I read it. But I understand that this trilogy, it's a bit hard to recommend because fantasy nowadays, modern fantasy, is quite different from fantasy that was written 40 years ago. So I'll let this trilogy up to you to decide if you want to read it or not. I still recommend it just so you can read. If you think Lord of the Rings is too big of a task to take or like a challenge, maybe read this trilogy first. It's not exactly the same. It has a lot of differences, but it's still that classical fantasy, I feel. And now we're moving on to the 90s, which it's the best decade, I feel. By this stage of my life, I had given up on the dragon craze. I had moved on from dragons, especially because the Dragonlance Chronicles taught me a lesson that you shouldn't always trust books that say dragon on their titles. But I was ready to read more things. And by more things, I mean I wasn't reading only about dragons, now I was reading also about magic, which pretty much all fantasy books have. And so, of course, a book that was called The Magician immediately grabbed my attention when I saw it, especially because the covers in Portugal were this very mysterious cloaked figure. But The Magician by Raymond D. Feist is not the book I chose for this video. It was just a bridge towards the book that I chose. And that's because I loved The Magician by Raymond D. Feist, and I started devouring everything that he had written. I thought that his world was really amazing. It was different from other epic fantasy that I had read, but I loved it, especially the merging of worlds. Again, a bit of science fiction into it. It was really engaging and I really loved it. And because I was devouring everything that Raymond D. Feist wrote, eventually I encountered one of the best trilogies I've ever read. And that was the Empire trilogy, written by Raymond D. Feist and by Jenny Wirtz. The three books of this trilogy are Daughter of the Empire, Servant of the Empire, and Mistress of the Empire. And they were written between 1987 and 19... I won't be reading the synopsis of this trilogy or of the first book because it basically summarizes the whole book, and I don't want to spoil you because it is really worth reading. This is one of the trilogies that I constantly recommend to people. And if you've read one of Raymond D. Feist's books and you didn't really like it, I still recommend you try this trilogy because it is very differently written. It's not as epic fantasy as all the others, and it's full of political intrigue. If you like that style of book, then this is like one of the best ones. I feel like the Empire trilogy, even though it's still set in Raymond D. Feist's worlds, I think Jenny Wirtz was able to elevate it so much more and give it so much more personality and plot and character and everything else. It's still a fantasy book. It's still full of magic and humans and other creatures, of course, but it also is full of political intrigue, and it's actually one of these Asian-inspired books that at the time I had never encountered, and I thought it was really amazing. At the time when I read this book, or this trilogy, political intrigue, I hadn't read much of it. I hadn't read A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin, and the only political intrigue that I had encountered was pretty much when the Aes Sedai from The Wheel of Time in Robert Jordan's books showed up, because that was a lot of intrigue happening. So I really thought this was one of the best political intrigues that I had read in my life. And the fact that I read this before I read many of the political intrigues, and I still think that this is one of the best ones and that it holds its place, really shows how well Jenny Wirtz and Raymond D. Feist were able to create this work of art or masterpiece. And the thing is, if you haven't read anything by Raymond D. Feist, it is still fine, because since these three books happen in a different world almost, you don't have to have backstory about everything else that happens in the main world of Raymond D. Feist's books. If you want to know every single detail and every single Easter egg, of course, feel free to read it, but it's not mandatory. You can just enjoy this trilogy by itself. This trilogy was probably the best read of my year that year, and I bet that if I read it or reread it this year, it would still hold a pretty high place. It's actually one of the trilogies that I wouldn't bother at all rereading it because it's actually so good. But I feel you got the message. I recommend it. Political intrigue, check. Please read it. It's gonna be amazing, and let me know what you think. And now we move on to the last recommendation, which is a book from the 2000s. Now, I seriously doubt many people have read or even heard about this book. I've never even heard anyone talk about it, so hopefully it won't just be something completely alien to you and you'll actually think it's a good recommendation and that you can go look for it and read. But I'll explain how I came to find it this so rare of a thing. The trilogy is called The Stone Dance of the Chameleon, and the reason I found it was because it was being published for the first time in Portugal, and the main detail is that it was a Portuguese author publishing it, even though it had been published in the UK, I feel, or somewhere else other than Portugal before it got published in Portugal. And so, of course, it was making an uproar. It was an international writer who was Portuguese, and it was finally coming to Portugal. The author in question was called, or is called, Ricardo Pinto. And by then, by the time these books were coming out, I was already matured in my reading style. I have read many things, Empire Trilogy, Dragon Riders of Pern, the Dragonlance Chronicles, amongst many other things. So I felt my horizons were quite wide, and I was just looking for different new things so that I could experience how my horizons could broaden even more if that was possible. These books were originally published between 1999 and 2009. So therefore I'm putting it in the 2000s decade because that's when it had the most impact. Now, the thing I'm not 100% sure is how these books are published currently. Because when I bought them, and in Portugal, the Portuguese edition was just 3 books. And I know that the author at a certain point decided to split the 3 books into 7 smaller books. And it was an interesting decision. I understand that they could be split because each book was quite chunky. They were like real big books, but 7 is just a weird number. Maybe it was just because how the story was framed, it would make more sense to do 7 smaller books. But so if you go look for this book, remember that it could be 3 or it could be a 7 series. But focusing on why I enjoyed these books. To be completely frank, it took me a while to actually enjoy these books. They were weird, the plot was very convoluted. I mean, not very convoluted, a bit convoluted. The characters were weird, the world building was even weirder. There were so many things that were a bit alien but familiar. It was this uncanny valley for fantasy where I didn't know if I was liking it or if I wasn't, but I kept reading it because it was still gripping me somehow. It's a weird feeling. And this was also the first time I encountered a non-straight protagonist in a fantasy series. So again, another situation that opened my eyes to new perspectives that I hadn't encountered till then, and I really enjoyed reading about it. And the end of the trilogy, I won't spoil it, but it was this really big plot twist that I could see coming. I didn't predict it, but all the pieces fit together at just the right moment. And it was one of those mind-blowing moments where you're like, oh my god, everything makes sense. And it was amazing. And I think that's what made my appreciation for this trilogy rise so much, when before it was just maybe average, and then after the last part it just elevated it. Overall, this trilogy has a lot of weird but a lot of good as well, and it ends up balancing, and it left an impact in my brain because I read it more than 10 years, almost 15 years ago, and I still remember vividly certain parts of it. I think it's just amazing in some ways, even though it's completely weird in others. So if you're looking for something new to read that you've never read before, some LGBTQIA+ representation, non-American authors, just go ahead. I recommend this book. You might enjoy it. Diversify your reading. Who knows? Maybe you'll enjoy some new thing. And with that, we return to the present, to our dear 2023, and we end our book recommendations. I hope you enjoyed your time traveling, and I hope you were able to get some good recommendations out of this video. Let me know if you've read any of these trilogies, especially Ricardo Pinto's one, because I need to speak with someone about this book, because I still haven't encountered anyone. So if you've read it, and if you're interested, just let me know. Comment down below. If you're new to the channel, subscribe and like the videos. Tell me what you want to see more, and I'll be seeing you soon. All right, adeus.